Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Welcome to this episode. I'm your host, Nikki Lowe, and today I'm talking about boundaries. And our ability to thrive as working mums is directly related to our ability to set boundaries. And what I find is that as women, particularly as mums, we can find it difficult to know what our boundaries are and communicate them. And I think there are many reasons for this. A lot of us are highly conscientious, and actually we'd rather take the stress hit than let somebody down. We might tend to have a high need to please. And actually there's a lot of social conditioning around this. A lot of our identities are tied up in how much we do for others. I think there can be a degree of fear of missing out, that if we say no to somebody or something, that we're missing out on something. And actually I found in my own life that I haven't had positive role models who have done this in a way that I felt that I could. Either they did it in a particularly masculine way that was too hard or cold or demanding, or they could actually be really intimidating with it. But when it's done with power and grace, actually boundaries can be a really beautiful thing. And it was recently I was watching the Netflix documentary about the Jeffrey Epstein debacle, or whatever you would like to kind of term it as. And it was really sad and quite disturbing, actually, listening to many of his victims talking about how they became involved in his horrific crimes. And what struck me was that all of them struggled to communicate their boundaries about what was okay and not okay, and actually how many of them blamed themselves when he stepped over a boundary. And as a mum, and a mum particularly of a daughter, it really reignited my passion for enforcing my own boundaries so that I can positively role model that for my daughter and for my son as well. So in this episode, I'm going to share with you what are boundaries and why they're so important, and actually 5 simple steps to setting them. But before we dive in, I'd like to do a listener shout out, and I'd like to thank you, Felicity, in Melbourne, Australia, who reviewed my podcast. And she said, I find this podcast really helpful and highly recommend it for any working mum. Thank you, Nikki. But actually it's thank you, Felicity. Not only is that amazing to hear, but I really appreciate you sharing your feedback. And you've probably heard me say before, it gets really lonely in podcast world. You know, I have no idea who's listening to these episodes and the impact that they're having on you. And actually, Felicity is somebody that I've never met, but she started emailing me after she found my podcast, and emails me after every episode she listens to. And honestly, when I receive her emails, it genuinely makes my day. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, Felicity, not only for taking the time to do that, but for sharing your feedback. So if you're listening to this and you've not yet left a review, it would be amazing if you did. You can just head over to iTunes or your favourite podcast platform and leave one there. And not only does it help me to continue to create really useful and relevant episodes for you, it also helps more working mums like you to benefit from the show, because the more reviews that are left, the more kind of iTunes and the podcast platforms show that this kind of podcast actually exists. So now I'm going to go back to boundaries. And what I notice in my work with my clients is this is an area that comes up quite a bit. And when we dive into it, not only is it an eye-opener for my clients around where they haven't been enforcing their boundaries, but when they do, the impact is always so positive. And that's why I wanted to talk to you about it today. So I think it's useful to start off talking about actually what do we mean when we're talking about boundary. So let's define what boundaries are. Boundaries are really guidelines or rules or limits that you create to identify for others and sometimes yourself what are reasonable and permissible ways for them to behave around you. And actually drawing healthy boundaries protects your time, your energy, your health and your emotional safety. And as working mums, obviously all of those things are really important. And ultimately they're crucial for creating kind of healthy relationships. And just like your values and needs, everyone has their own individual boundaries. The fact that you need one boundary and someone else needs a different one doesn't make either of you wrong. It just makes us all different. And ultimately, boundaries are really about self-worth. The better we get at setting our boundaries, the more our self-worth improves. And actually, it then becomes a self-fulfilling kind of upward cycle. And the more our self-worth improves, the better we get at setting boundaries. And ultimately, in order for us to thrive as working mums, it's vital for us to protect our time and energy so that we can focus on what matters most. And actually, our boundaries are what protects our time and energy. And often, when I'm working with people around boundaries and also in my own life, they can feel really difficult to actually communicate. Sometimes we can feel that either we're being unreasonable or we're being demanding or we're being needy, or there's loads of labels that we can put around this. But actually when we do it and we put our boundaries in place and communicate them gracefully but with powerful impact, they enable us to be more compassionate and loving towards the people that matter most to us. And I love Brené Brown's kind of quote on this. She says that compassionate people ask for what they need. They say no when they need to, and they say yes when they actually mean it. They're compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. And I think culturally, as women, we tend to be more people pleasers. And as mothers, you may have heard me talk on the podcast before, I think we can easily fall into martyrdom if we're not careful. So it's common that we haven't learned how to set boundaries. And as I said earlier, we may not have had role models and women in our lives that have role modelled it for us at all or in a positive way. So if you're not familiar with setting them or it feels uncomfortable, you're not alone. But if you're willing to lean into that discomfort, I promise you the benefits are so powerful. And not only that, as I said earlier, we can role model it for our children, what it's like for them to have healthy boundaries in their lives too. And the type of boundaries that we can put into place, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but hopefully helps you to start imagining the kind of boundaries I'm talking about and how they might apply in your life. They're things like time boundaries. So how much time you spend with someone doing something. So it could be time boundaries around work or around particular relationships. And actually, I noticed this just last week. I was having a conversation with my neighbour over the fence in our garden, and she was sharing something with me that was really important to her, and I really wanted to respect that and show up for her and listen with kind of real compassion. And it's really important for me that I have a good relationship with my neighbours. You know, community is really important to me. But it just so happened when we started having this conversation, it was getting to my daughter's dinner time. So she was getting to that point in the day where she was quite niggly, she was tired, she was hungry, and she started to pull at my trouser leg as I was talking to my neighbour. And I really felt split because I wanted to show up for my neighbour, but obviously I wanted to show up for my daughter. And my neighbour was like deep in conversation, and as I said, she was talking about something that was really important to her. So she just kept on talking, and at the same time my daughter kept on pulling at me and kind of calling me, and I felt really split in that moment. And I'm not proud proud to say that actually I didn't enforce my boundary properly. So I kind of swallowed my own need, and my need in that moment was actually, on reflection, I didn't realise it fully at the time, but on reflection, what was important to me was being there for my daughter. My daughter's only 2. She doesn't understand boundaries. She doesn't understand kind of human behaviour to that level. If I'd said to my neighbour, look, do you mind if we come back to this conversation? I really want to have this conversation with you, but now's a little bit difficult. Can we come back to it in half an hour or an hour? And I didn't. I kind of got stuck, and I got stuck in people pleasing, that I didn't want to be rude to my neighbour. And so actually I let my daughter carry on pulling me and getting frustrated to the point that she started crying, and it all kind of, it wasn't a meltdown as such, but it was an avoidable situation, because what I hadn't done at that point was communicate my time boundary. So that's one type of boundary. The other is around physical boundaries. So what feels okay for you around physical proximity. And I think this is quite an important one at the moment. Time of recording this, we're still in kind of COVID and about social distancing. So actually, are people respecting your personal boundary about that social distancing? And they can be things around sexual boundaries, that physical, how much space you share with others. And I think that comes back to the point about Jeffrey Epstein, about actually he overstepped and took advantage of his victims with, they're knowing that they would feel uncomfortable about enforcing their physical boundaries. The other one's around conversational boundaries, so the topics that you're open to discussing and not discussing. What's it appropriate for people to say or not say in front of you? Things like relationship boundaries, the boundaries that you kind of agree with your family, your friends, your partner. There's things like our personal boundaries. So the things that you have in place with yourself based on your own awareness and needs. And I've spoken before on this podcast about, I have a need for some quiet time built into my day. I can easily become overstimulated and overwhelmed by the noise and interaction. So for me, it's about how do I understand that boundary and communicate it. And things like content boundaries, the things you will or won't consume on TV or social media. So one for me around that is actually I can't, and I choose not to consume anything leading up to my bedtime that gets my adrenal system heightened. So that could be a horror movie, or a movie that's got violence in, or a kind of topic that disturbs me, that gets my adrenaline up. That if I try to go to bed on that, it's really unhealthy for me. So I choose to put boundaries in place around that. So hopefully that started to give you an idea of the type of boundaries. And what I wanted to move on to now is some steps to help you think about. So once I've started to gain some awareness around my boundaries, so how do I put those into place? And I think the first step is what we've talked about, is really identifying when a boundary is needed. And again, often in my work, when I first talk about boundaries, my clients sometimes look at me with like a glazed look around, I have no idea what you're on about. Or they know what I'm on about, but they're like, actually, I really struggle to articulate them. And I think what can be useful is to identify our boundaries. It can be useful to check in with our emotions and our physical sensations. So often you'll know when a boundary is needed or needs reinforcing if you feel kind of some uncomfortable or unpleasant emotions. So it might be that you feel frustrated or anxious or angry or resentful. Those are normally indications that something's not quite working, and often it can be a boundary. Or it's just noticing physical sensations in your body. You might notice that when you're with somebody or you're having a conversation about something, your shoulders might kind of tighten up, or your jaw tenses up, or you recoil. And again, those are kind of subtle messages, and sometimes not so subtle, but they're often quite subtle messages around boundaries. So the first step is start to identify that and tune into it. And the second step is then to give yourself some time. Don't feel that you've got to respond immediately. You can take a breath, you can take a moment, or you can take even longer before you respond. But I would encourage you to create a gap between your norm, that stimulus or whatever it is that kind of knocks against a boundary, and your normal response. Because if we can buy ourselves some time, that's when we can reflect on actually what is the boundary, what needs communicating here, and how do I enforce it in a way that feels right for me. And then the third step is really about taking responsibility. So our boundaries are actually our responsibility, not somebody else's. So your need to have a boundary in place isn't anybody else's responsibility or their faults. And often we can feel uncomfortable around this, and so uncomfortable about the need to set a boundary that we tend to kind of get into resentment or blame people for the fact that we need one. And I know that I've done that in the past. And one example for me is actually with my in-laws. And they do the most wonderful thing that prior to lockdown, every Sunday, they would invite us around for Sunday dinner, which, for them, it's really important for them to get their family together and for us to spend quality time together. And they want to feed us and nourish us by cooking us a lovely meal, which their intention is amazing. But they choose to have Sunday dinner quite late on a Sunday, so Sunday evening. And actually, since I was a little girl, Sunday evenings have always been really sacred time for me. I've always actually had a ritual around my Sunday evenings about preparing me for the week ahead. And I used to do it from kind of being a kind of schoolgirl. I would get my school bag ready, my pencil case ready, and I would tidy my bedroom, change my bed sheets, and it was a real ritual for me about starting the week in a positive way. And it's something that's still really important to me. But when my in-laws used to invite me round, I used to think, it's so lovely. Yes, Sunday evenings are important to me, but they're important to them. And I overrode my boundary, my need for that Sunday evening kind of ritual time. And over time of allowing my boundary to be overstepped, I started to become really resentful, and I didn't enjoy going round on a Sunday evening. And I got into this internal debate with myself. My wise part of me was saying, just have the conversation about, we'd love to see you, but this time doesn't work for us or for me. Could we look at changing the time? And if that doesn't work, I totally understand it, but actually I won't be able to come around as often. So my wise part of myself knew that having that conversation was important, but kind of my inner saboteur would override it it's really my people pleaser was like, no, you're being ungrateful, you're being unkind, why should it matter for a few hours difference? And so for a long, long time, I didn't allow myself to communicate and have that conversation around my boundary. And I really became resentful, which was completely unfair because actually I wasn't taking responsibility. So that third step around taking responsibility is quite important to keep us in that kind of healthy relationship, as I talked about. And the fourth step is really owning your words around how you communicate them. So when we use language, it's about saying, I feel, not you make me feel, because the you make me or it makes me can have the tone of blaming and can actually create an kind of dysfunctional dialogue around this. So I would really encourage you to own your boundary and say, I feel uncomfortable when this happens, and what I would really like is this. And at the time of recording this podcast, I've recently delivered my Stay Sane This Summer course for some of my working mums, and one of the things that I've done in that course is really give them communication tips on how we can communicate our boundaries in a really powerful way, and there's a really lovely process to that. So, but to simply put, it's around owning your words that I feel, not you make me feel. And the final step in this is about staying in your power. often when we're communicating a boundary, we feel the need to justify it. And when we do that, we can get into this kind of long-winded request that actually reduces our power, and we reduce the impact. And just know you don't need to explain why you're setting the boundary, and you don't need to convince anybody about it. And you actually don't need for them to agree, because sometimes people may not agree with our boundary, and that's okay. And if we get into this kind of battle of trying to get them to agree, we start to give our power away. It's really about just stating your need for a boundary, making a simple request in a kind way, and stating the consequences if that boundary is not able to be met. And then kind of we've taken our part of the responsibility in this. We can't take responsibility for people meeting that boundary. All we can do is respond to how they then respond. But ultimately, setting boundaries is vital for us if we want to have the time and the energy and the health that we want to be kind of thriving as a working mum. So I hope those 5 steps around identifying your boundaries, giving yourself some time to understand what's needed, taking the responsibility to communicate it, owning your words when you communicate it, and staying in your power enables you to reflect on what boundaries are useful for you, and hopefully it sparks some ideas about where you might need to put some in place or reinforce some. Hopefully that's been useful. Until next time, bye. If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too. So if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.